Switching gears now to Fukushima, the disaster, the debacle that is still pumping thousands of tons of radioactive waste into the oceans. Dr. Helen Caldicott is going to talk about that right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Helen Caldicott has spent more than 40 years as part of an international campaign to educate the public about the hazards of the nuclear age and changes in human behavior that protect the environment. In particular, she's written extensively about Fukushima and the disaster that seemingly dropped off the radar screen for most of us Americans, at least, if we get our news from the mainstream media. Dr. Caldicott making her first appearance on Coast to Coast. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
You're in Australia.
I am.
What time of day is it there?
It is 6:15 approximately at night.
Okay, well, I'm glad I didn't get you up too early. Dr. Helen, what is your doctorate in?
I'm a physician and I'm a pediatrician. My specialty is cystic fibrosis, the most common fatal genetic disease of childhood. I trained at Harvard, and I'm a pediatrician.
How did you get involved in nuclear issues?
Yeah. Well, when I was about 18 or a bit younger, I read a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute.
Oh, yeah.
And it was set in Melbourne, where I grew up in Australia. It was about a nuclear war that occurred by accident, and everyone in the world was killed except people in Melbourne because we were so far south. And gradually the radioactive cloud came down to Melbourne, and people had their last gin and tonic at the Melbourne Club. And then the government dispensed cyanide capsules so people could kill their babies immediately rather than dying of the terrible effects of acute radiation illness, vomiting and bleeding to death. And at the end of the book, the beautiful, elegant streets of Melbourne still stood with trams and bits of paper blowing down in the breeze and a blind gently flapping. And that was the end of life on Earth. And that image marred my soul, and I was never the same again.
Let's talk about...
Then I entered first-year medical school at 17, and I learned how radiation causes genetic abnormalities and cancer. And at that time, 1956, Russia and America were going hell for leather, blowing up bombs in the atmosphere, heavily irradiating the northern hemisphere. And as a young, innocent medical student, at the age of 17, I couldn't understand what these men thought they were doing. And so that's always been part of my psyche.
I don't know what it's like in Australia, but here it seems like we hear very little about Fukushima in mainstream media. It's as if the problem went away. Is it the same there?
Yes, it is actually. And the uranium in the Fukushima reactors was Australian uranium. So we're in the process of killing a lot of people, hundreds of thousands, I would think, over time, because it takes a long time for cancer to incubate. We don't get much news here either, unless there's another major accident at Fukushima, which is absolutely on the cards. There could be another explosion, a huge release of radiation, all sorts of things, or another earthquake which could collapse some of the buildings. So we're on the tip of an iceberg, the tip of the sort of cliff of real nuclear catastrophe. But because Obama's pro-nuclear, because of the very great power of the nuclear industry in America, which is allied to the nuclear weapons industry, and because of the abysmal ignorance of journalists at this time about the medical effects of radiation and nuclear power, this issue is not being attended to. It will be in time, but at the moment it's being ignored, which is extraordinary.
Paint a picture for us what the situation on the ground is at Fukushima now.
Okay, so within hours and days, 3 huge nuclear power plants melted down. These power plants were designed by General Electric, built in the 70s, and I knew the 3 GE engineers who designed them, and they resigned because they knew that these reactors were fallible and not safe. They testified before the U.S. Congress, but it made no difference. So they built 6 nuclear power plants, 6, on an earthquake fault. Japan, of course, is intersected by lots and lots of earthquake faults. And the risk of having an earthquake, they predicted, was 1 in a million or whatever. So there was an earthquake. a huge one, 9 on the Richter scale, and then a massive tsunami resulted and came in and absolutely drowned the reactors, the external electricity supply that supplies the power to the water pumps that have to pump 1 million gallons of water each minute to each reactor. That's 6 reactors, 6 million gallons a minute failed because there was no electricity. There were diesel pumps beneath the reactors in the basement, but they got flooded. Therefore, there was no power to cool these intensely hot 100 tons mass of seething radioactivity in the reactors. And within hours, the heat was so profound that this radioactive material, 100 tons, started to melt. And it melted its way in 3 reactors through a 6 inches of steel in the containment vessel and onto the reactor floor. And indeed, we think that they have maybe melted their way into the earth, which is called the melt through to China syndrome by the nuclear industry. At the same time, huge amounts of radiation were released, and at the same time, because of certain dynamics, there were 4 hydrogen explosions which totally blew the roof off 4 of the reactors. And so massive amounts of radiation were released. The government of Japan knew where the radiation was going, as did the American government that was flying planes overhead to find out where the radiation went. But the government of Japan failed to tell the Japanese people where the radiation was going because they didn't want to create, quote, panic, end quote. So hundreds of thousands of people fled in the direction of the highest radiation doses. At the same time, huge amounts of radioactive water were emitted into the Pacific Ocean, higher than any other event in history. This is the worst industrial accident ever to have occurred, but it's not over, because what's happened is that the Fukushima reactors were built on an ancient riverbed, and there are mountains behind the reactors, and water keeps pouring down from the mountains underneath the reactors. Now, when they were operating, they could pump that water out, but now they can't. And what has happened in the ground beneath the reactors has become sodden, sort of liquefied mud. 2 of the buildings, Unit 3, which had a meltdown, and Unit 4, are very perilously damaged. And if there's another earthquake greater than 7 at the site, it is thought that Unit 3 could collapse on top of its molten core, producing maybe a huge fire. We don't know, but releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. And Unit 4 was emptied of its radioactive fuel just before the accident, just serendipitously. And over 100 tons, about 250 tons actually, of highly radioactive, very hot uranium is in a cooling pool 100 feet above the ground, resting perilously on this damaged building, which is buckled. Now, if there's an earthquake, that building could collapse. Down would come the cooling pool. The water would drain out of it. The fuel rods would catch fire, and 10 times more cesium than was released at Chernobyl would be released into the atmosphere, and you would have to be very worried in the Northern Hemisphere. Also, TEPCO now, Tokyo Electric Power Company, has decided to try and remove those rods from that cooling pool. But because the building was so damaged and the crane they used previously fell down, they've erected a new steel structure around Building 4 so they can put a huge crane on top. Now, when you remove radioactive rods from the cooling pool from the racks, and they're racked vertically in water, it's always done by a computer. And the distances have to be, they're millimeters, and they have to be, the rods must be raised perfectly. But now it has to be done by hand virtually by workers who've been recruited by Yakuza, who is the mafia of Japan. This has never been done before manually. It's very clear that many of the rods have been damaged because of the earthquake, and it's like pulling a bent cigarette out of a cigarette package, and the cigarette might break. If it breaks, large amounts of radiation would be released, and then workers would have to evacuate the site, leaving no one to care for what's going on at the moment. Or if two rods touch each other, a critical mass could occur with, like, not a nuclear bomb, similar to that, but very serious for the workers. The other thing is that they're pumping out 400 tons of water a day, very radioactive, from under the reactors, because the water is coming down from the mountain and sweeping over the damaged radioactive cores that have melted onto the containment vessel or into the ground, and the water is intensely radioactive. 400 tons is being emitted into the Pacific Ocean every day, but also they're collecting 300 tons a day of this terribly radioactive water, and they're storing it in huge tanks, a sort of tank farm of about 1,060 tanks at the moment. They erect 3 new tanks a week. But the tanks are connected by plastic tubing and by duct tape. They are not meant to last longer than 6 years. They have rubber seals. They're rusting and corroding, and they're leaking. But they're leaking very high levels of radiation. The radiation in the last few days went up 6,700 times above what they measured 2 days before. The workers being exposed to very high levels of radiation, gamma radiation like X-rays and other sort of radiation. They are not being adequately monitored to see what is happening to their blood cells or if they're getting radiation sickness. A lot of them are homeless people from Tokyo, brought in by the Yakuza. Some are mentally sick and retarded. They're running out of human bodies to run this whole thing. If there's another earthquake, it's very likely that many of these tanks are going to collapse, and all this intensely radioactive water will flow into the Pacific. But as well as that, there is no way to fix this situation, and it's going to be ongoing, as I've just described, for the next 50 years. And what people need to know in North America is that the air masses of the northern and southern hemisphere do not mix at the equator, so you will get all the fallout. My family's in Boston, my young grandchildren, and if there is a major release of radiation, I'm going to fly them to Australia. Also, the Pacific Ocean is becoming more and more radioactive. Mind you, it's a huge mass of water. The radiation has been diluted, but the radiation like cesium-137 and strontium-90, and I can name lots of them, concentrate by orders of magnitude at each step of the food chain, like into the crustaceans hundreds of times, then into the algae, and then the crustaceans eat the algae, and then the little fish eat the crustaceans, and then the big fish. And so the higher up the food chain you get, the more concentrated these elements become, and indeed they've found a lot of tuna off the coast of California containing cesium from Fukushima. So they just swam from Fukushima to California. The high radiation doses, the plume of radiation travelling across the Pacific as I speak, is likely to hit the west coast of Canada and Oregon and Washington early next year, and then California will be impacted later in the year by this huge plume of radiation. But what I want to stress is people don't know how to stop this. TEPCO is corrupt, allied to the Japanese government. They're trying to save money because their banks want them to save money, so they're cutting corners at every step. The Japanese are very proud, so they have not invited in the international nuclear community and engineers and the like to help them. And this is a global public health ongoing catastrophe, and no one's attending to it.
Wow. Back to this point about the Yakuza. Now, you're saying that they're basically corralling people and getting them to work. Are they forcing them to work in this situation, or just picking people who are desperate?
Recruit them and pay them, but skim off their money. there are hundreds of subcontractors. So, and this is apparently routine in Japanese society. TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which runs the Fukushima reactors, and they're just operators. They know how to turn switches and stuff. They're not nuclear engineers or architects or the like. They have subcontracted the, quote, cleaning up of areas to run the Fukushima reactors to hundreds of subcontractors, many of which are actually the Yakuza. So you can't imagine a more deleterious situation in human terms. It's kind of like a science fiction story, but the scary thing is it's ongoing, and the Japanese government is lying about it overtly. The doctors have been told by their superiors not to tell people if their illness is related to radiation. Lots of people are developing very severe nosebleeds, which is a sign of acute radiation illness because radiation damages the platelets that cause clotting. Already, up to 44 children in Fukushima are suspected and have developed thyroid cancer. Thyroid cancer is so rare in children, 1 in a million children get it. So this is just, 2.5 years after the accident, we're seeing a huge spike in thyroid cancer, which indicates these children got a very high dose of radiation, and it indicates they and all their families and 2 million people or more live in very high radiation areas that were evacuated by the Russians. So the Russians were much more proactive after Chernobyl than the Japanese, which is interesting. The Japanese seem not to care about their people at all. And we are expecting, as physicians and radiobiologists, an awful lot of cancer. And what people need to know is that Chernobyl has already induced the deaths of probably over 1 million people by now of cancer and leukemia and congenital deformities. And
this is worse? Wow. And this is worse. Dr. Helen Caldicott is giving us the bad news about Fukushima, and there's much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. We're just getting started. We'll be back. We are facing an environmental catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. If you just heard the first segment of our interview with Dr. Helen Caldicott, you know that the mess over in Fukushima is something that is not only a Japanese problem, but a world problem. When we come back, more on those consequences, how they might affect us here. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Helen Caldicott, let's talk a little bit more about one of the sentences that caught my attention. You said that everyone in the Northern Hemisphere should be worried about this. I think there's a tendency, because Japan is so far away, 5,000 or 6,000 miles away, what could possibly affect us here? But you were suggesting if there's another earthquake, which is an earthquake-prone zone, that an enormous amount of material could go into the atmosphere. What is the range of options there about how it might affect us here in this country from just the air? Okay, so several days after the initial accident, the ambient levels of radiation in Seattle went up 40,000 times above normal, meaning that the radiation cloud had flown across the Pacific quite fast, several days, and it hit Seattle, and in fact much of America experienced fallout, depending on the rain. The rain brings the radiation down from the atmosphere. And so high radiation levels were found in various parts of America, including Boston. And they're also found in Sweden and Europe and the like. And the air circulates, of course, from west to east around the globe, not mixing at the equator. Now, if there's a major release of radiation, like even more than has already occurred, which could happen if Building 4 collapses with its cooling pool, or Building 3 collapses and impinges upon that molten core in its basement, and God knows what would happen with release of radiation of that, then, well, if Building 4 collapses, it's the equivalent, I think, of 14,000 Hiroshima bombs would be released from that cooling pool burning. You would get a lot of fallout over in North America and Canada and indeed around the globe. And what happens is that when strontium-90, for instance, lands on the soil, strontium-90 lasts for about 300 years.
takes a long time to decay away to nothing. It is taken up by the roots of the grass and concentrated hundreds of times. Then the cattle eat the grass, concentrated in the milk particularly, and the meat, and then we drink the milk, and say a lactating woman drinks the milk from a cow containing strontium-90. Strontium-90 passes through the breast, irradiating breast tissue and possibly mutating genes in the cells that are called regulatory genes that control the rate of cell division. And if that happens to some cells in the lactating breast, a woman doesn't know it, can't smell, taste, or feel radiation in the milk, and the cell will sit latently and quietly from any time for 5 to 60 years. Then one day it starts dividing in an uncontrolled fashion, and that's a cancer. And we generally can't stop this uncontrolled rate of growth. Then the baby drinks the milk, and babies are 10 to 20 times more sensitive than adults because their cells are rapidly dividing, and in that state of mitosis, they're very sensitive to be damaged by radiation. So the baby could easily get leukemia because strontium-90 is a calcium analog, and it deposits in bones and teeth. And so it would irradiate a few cells in the bone, could cause bone cancer, or cells in the bone marrow where the red and white blood cells are made, so that leukemia could develop later, which is cancer of the white blood cells. And leukemia means white blood, and the blood gets filled up with immature white blood cells that can't fight infection. The patient becomes very anemic. There's no room for platelets, which cause clotting, to develop in the bone marrow, and the patient dies of massive hemorrhage and infection, much like the way AIDS patients die. But what people need to know is that, if I sneeze on you, you're sneezing in 2 days. The incubation time for cold is 2 days. Same for flu. For measles, mumps, whooping cough, chicken pox, it's 3 weeks. But for cancer, it's a long time. Children, it's shorter, like maybe 2 years, but, it goes up to the length of the patient's life, up to 80 years. And we are now still studying Hibakusha people who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're still getting cancers in higher than normal incidences, and new sort of cancers are appearing, like cancers of the renal tract and the bone marrow. And so each cancer has its own, what we call latent period of carcinogenesis, its own incubation time. And we're still learning.
My gosh. How accurate is your information about the situation on the ground? I'm curious about how wide of an area, for example, of Japan is already contaminated to the point where nobody can live there, and how long that might last.
People are living. I mean, some scientists in Japan saying up to 10 million people are living in very, very highly radioactive areas. Some people say it's 2 million, but they're children too. And these children, they're sent to school, they're being fed food being grown in Fukushima, and lots of the food in Fukushima, including the rice, contains cesium and all sorts of other very nasty elements. And that food will be radioactive for hundreds of years. The cesium lasts for 300 years, and there are literally hundreds of radioactive elements that are released when there's a meltdown, hundreds, and many of them have not been studied biologically. But people are living in these incredibly radioactive zones. Children are not allowed to go outside to play. They're getting fat because they have no exercise. They're wearing masks in school. The children are really scared because they understand what's going on. They're testing thyroids of hundreds of thousands of children in Fukushima Prefecture by ultrasound and finding nodules and cysts and all sorts of abnormalities, probably which are precancerous, many of them. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because every cancer, stomach, bowel, breast, lung, liver, brain, whatever, can be caused by radiation exposure. So we're sitting on an ongoing catastrophe, not just for this generation, but because the food will remain active, radioactive for hundreds of years. We're talking about future generations. And the worst part of it is, if these radioactive elements get into the testicles or ovaries, which they're bound to do, or those genitalia are irradiated, then genes in the eggs and sperm will be mutated. And that means that the incidence of congenital disease, genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, diabetes, dwarfism, hemophilia, hemochromatosis, there are about 6,000 now described, will over time increase in frequency down the time track to all future generations. So what we're doing, even if there's no meltdown, you've got 70,000 tons of highly radioactive waste with nowhere to put it. And it's going to leak. No container lasts longer than 100 years, and it's going to leak into the water supply and concentrate in the food. So you can imagine generations hence waking up in the morning, their babies being born deformed because they've been exposed to radiation in utero as the fetus was developing, or babies being born with genetic disease, the breast milk already radioactive, children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 60 because they've been exposed so early to radioactive elements in their food and their breast milk and via the placenta. That's the legacy we're leaving to our descendants. We are destroying the very building blocks of life. And that's what's never discussed. And we are not the only species that have genes. All plants and all animals have genes, and they can all develop genetic abnormalities. And indeed, there's a wonderful researcher called Tim Mousseau who's venturing into the very high radiation exclusion zones around Fukushima and Chernobyl and looking at the birds and the insects and the spiders and finding already mutations amongst these animals and birds because they reproduce very fast and their lifespan is short, whereas we have to wait generations to see what sort of genetic abnormalities we will be producing amongst ourselves. And by then we'll all be dead.
Are there any reliable figures on people who may have already died from radiation exposure, or is it hard to get accurate information there? Are they keeping pretty close?
There are reliable figures from from Chernobyl, and if you go to the New York Academy of Sciences website, you can download a book called Chernobyl: the medical consequences of Chernobyl, put together by Russian scientists, where they got together 5,000 peer-reviewed papers from the Russian literature, written by doctors and bioradiologists and all sorts of people, and it's the scariest book I've ever read. And as I said previously, lots of diseases are caused by radiation exposure, including diabetes, including heart disease, including thyroid abnormalities, congenital abnormalities. All sorts of diseases are caused by exposure to high doses of radiation. And this book is probably the most profound book I've ever read in my medical career. So you can transpose that data to Fukushima and predict or prognosticate what will happen there. Mind you, the pro-nuclear scientists, who are mostly physicists and businessmen and engineers in America who do not understand the medical effects of radiation and who pontificate about how, certain doses are safe and certain... There are no doses of radiation that are safe. Each dose you receive, be it an X-ray, a dental X-ray, walking through an X-ray machine in an airport, adds to your risk of getting cancer. So never have an unnecessary X-ray, nor do you walk through those X-ray machines at the airport. You have a full body search. But they do not understand radiation, and they say, well, the Russians don't have proper peer review, and therefore we'll discount this extraordinary book from the Russian scientist called Chernobyl, published by the New York Academy of Sciences. So they are pernicious, these people. And someone said to me the other day, you know how the German children used to say about Daddy or Grandpa? What did you do during the war? Did you run the trains transporting the Jews to the gas ovens? And it won't be long before I think children are going to say, but Daddy, why did you work in the nuclear industry? Because this is a long-term murderous industry. And I say that advisedly and carefully as a very highly qualified physician.
Well, we will expand the conversation to nuclear industry in general in a moment. I want to stick with what's going on in Japan now. Can you describe for me the ocean around this nuke plant, what the consequences have been in the immediate area?
Yes, well, I said that TEPCO's now admitted that ever since the accident 2.5 years ago, every day 300 to 400 tons of highly radioactive water are emitted into the ocean. The bottom-feeding fish are being found to be very radioactive because a lot of these elements settle onto the ocean floor. It was thought by oceanographers, including Ken Brusella, who works at the I can't think of it, his institute at the moment, say that they would have thought that the level of cesium in the fish and other elements would have fallen, but it's remaining the same or even going up because you would expect it to be diluted and kind of dissipate over time, but because the levels are remaining the same or going up in the fish and in the water, it means that Fukushima is just extruding huge amounts of radiation continuously into the Pacific.
I just wondered if there was like a dead zone around the plant.
No, they're still catching fish there. I mean, it's not enough to kill the fish, but it's certainly the fish are very radioactive. The other fascinating point is that a lot of freshwater fish being caught in the Fukushima prefecture are highly radioactive because a lot of the radiation was blown inland and landed on mountains and hills, and it gets washed down by the rain into the rivers. And the rivers and the lakes are very, very radioactive. And the fish being caught, they're measuring up to 2,500 becquerels per kilogram when they say the safe dose is 100 becquerels per kilogram. Actually, for you people, it's 1,200 becquerels per kilogram. You've got very bad regulation laws in America. But these fish are terribly radioactive. So what is happening is that as it rains and snows, the water from the mountains washes down through the hillsides. The leaves of the trees are radioactive because the trees are sucking up the radiation from the soil. The cedar blossoms this year were terribly radioactive, full of cesium-137. And, of course, when the blossom and the pollen falls, it gets wafted around all over the place. People are inhaling it. I can't tell you what an ongoing biological and medical catastrophe this is. And no one knows what to do about it because this has never occurred before. 3 meltdowns, an earthquake and a tsunami, and no one ever wrote about this before in the engineering literature. My friend Arnie Gunderson, who is an extraordinary nuclear engineer, who suddenly realized that what he was doing was crazy, and he got fired when he spoke out against nuclear power. He lost his house, but he knows what's going on. And he said what they should do is hire a firm like Bechtel, which, unlike Bechtel, they build nuclear power plants and they make nuclear weapons and stuff, but they are very highly qualified nuclear engineers, and maybe they could go in and advise the Japanese government and take their, suit coats off and get stuck into helping the Japanese. But the Japanese are not inviting people in.
My gosh, is the Japanese people, are they motivated about this, or are they not getting the straight story either from their media? I would think that they would be pretty mad about the whole thing,
well,
up in arms about it.
Well, they're not getting a straight story, but a lot of them understand, and there have been demonstrations in front of the Prime Minister's house of 140,000 people, although those demonstrations are falling off in numbers at the moment. The ones who know are the women and the mothers, and they're terrified. And I recently did a trip to Japan and addressed 2 huge public meetings and gave them the medical consequences of radiation and fallout and radioactive elements and the whole thing, and how they get into the body and how they cause cancer and the like. And then in question time, and many of them were women, it turned into a sort of medical consultation session where a woman would stand up and say, what happens if I breastfeed my baby? is the baby sensitive? Does radiation get into breast milk? Or my child's got diarrhea. What does that mean? And many of the women evacuated Fukushima and fled to other safer areas in Japan, and it's caused, divorces because the men can't move because they've got their jobs, or they won't move, but the women know, and they take their children with them. But many are still living in incredibly radioactive areas, as I stressed, much higher than around Chernobyl. And some are practicing psychic numbing, some are not. They're feeding radioactive food to kindergarten children. They take radioactive rice and they dilute it with non-radioactive rice, but it gets reconcentrated back in the body, the radiation. I could go on and on. So they're suffering acute anxiety and they're not being told the truth. And I have to say that when I lectured, they were so grateful, even though the news I gave them was not good. As a doctor, they came up and they gave me presents and they said, "Thank you so much for telling us the truth."
Because they're not hearing it from anywhere else.
No.
I wonder if nuclear energy has much of a future in Japan. Have they got to that point where they said, we're not going to build these anymore?
Oh, I think nuclear energy is dead, period, around the world. I mean, as this accident gets worse and worse by the day, the world is going to wake up and say, God almighty, this is crazy. I predicted that when it happened, that this would signal the end of nuclear power. It takes a while for people to learn, to be educated, to wake up, to understand. But it makes building new reactors extraordinarily expensive because they have to put in new mechanisms and controls and machinery because of Fukushima. But it costs now $12 to $15 billion to build a reactor. I mean, that's just crazy. No one in Wall Street will invest in it. It's all government funded. It's a socialized industry.
Dr. Helen Caldicott with the bad news about the nuclear plant in Japan. We'll be back with more and your questions, opening up the phone lines in the next hour. Stay with us. Much more to come on Coast to Coast AM. The health of the planet is what we're talking about with Dr. Helen Caldicott, who says that the situation at the Japanese nuke plant is dire, that it is something that could affect all of us, everyone in the Northern Hemisphere anyway, and that we'd better pay attention because this is going to be going on for a long time, poisoning our planet for perhaps 50 years or more. In a moment, we'll return. I'll ask a couple of more questions about the nuclear industry in general. Then we'll take your calls for my guest, Dr. Helen Caldicott. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. 2 days ago, we had an earthquake reported off the coast of Japan, 7.6 on the Richter scale. Dr. Caldicott, when you saw the news of that, were you holding your breath?
I was worried. It was a couple of hundred miles offshore, mind you, not right at the reactor itself, but I was nevertheless worried. And it's still not clear whether any damage was done to the reactors or to the tanks and their plastic piping and duct tape. We'll find out. TEPCO is not very assiduously monitoring the situation, and they only come out with information and data days later, so we'll wait and see.
You know, I can see somebody saying, what's the big deal? All this proves, it doesn't prove nuclear power is dangerous. It says it doesn't prove we shouldn't build nuclear plants. It just means we shouldn't build nuclear plants on an earthquake zone in its tsunami area. What do you say to that?
I think those people are pretty stupid. The fact is that global warming is antithetical to the safe functioning of nuclear power. I said that each reactor requires 1 million gallons a minute to keep it cool. Indeed, during a hot summer in France recently, the river levels dropped where the reactors were located, and the water was too hot to cool the reactors, so they had to close the reactors down. Meanwhile, great storms are occurring around the coast, and many reactors are, of course, built at ocean levels around the coast. As the sea rises, plus huge storms, it's quite possible that the control rooms of these reactors could be flooded, leading to a meltdown. And, you know, they're all open to terrorist attacks and the like. They only operate for 40 years. And as someone said recently, to decrease the CO2 level in the atmosphere by 10%, you would have to triple the number of nuclear reactors in the world today, and there are about 440, all of which are reaching the end of their lives, all of which are frightfully expensive to reproduce and build new ones, despite the turn on by the nuclear industry saying we'll have small modular reactors that are safe and burn waste, which is a lie. If you want to know about that, I'll go into it. But nuclear is dead on its feet. The fact is that renewables like wind and solar are becoming so cheap, and the technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper by the day, and many people are investing in it. What should happen is, instead of the American government spending over $1 trillion on weapons and killing, let's be frank, with the Pentagon, they should transfer that money to saving the planet. The true national security issue is whether or not our grandchildren will survive. It's going to be predicted to be 6 degrees centigrade hotter by the end of the century, which is antithetical to life. People cannot live at those temperatures. And it's not just 6 degrees. I mean, temperatures go up and down and fluctuate, so it could even be 10 degrees hotter, some days. So where the real national and international security issue is global warming, the ever-present threat of nuclear war, because Russia and America, who own 94% of the 20,000 nuclear weapons in the world, still target each other with over 1,000 each. And all your cities and towns are targeted with at least one hydrogen bomb. There are about 30 targeted on New York as I speak by the Russians. So nuclear war could occur tonight by an accident, by a hacker hacking into the early warning system, by computer error, by human error, or by international anxiety, say if Israel attacks Iran with a nuclear weapon, or there's another 9/11 attack where no one knew what was happening, and America went on to the highest state of nuclear alert just before the button's pressed. So we are still facing the ever-present threat of nuclear war and global annihilation, number one. We're facing the threat of nuclear power plants, whether or not they melt down from the nuclear waste, which over time will induce epidemics of cancer, leukemia and genetic disease, and the ever-present threat of global warming. We can fix two of those. We can eliminate nuclear weapons if Russia and America have the courage and audacity to take the lead, number one, and to show the world what wise countries can do. Number two, we can stop burning fossil fuel now and cover every house in America with solar panels, every parking lot with solar panels, so we all drive electric cars which are solar-powered, have windmills everywhere, upgrade the grid, have a computerized grid, so when the sun's not shining, we get wind from the windmills power, etc. As for nuclear waste, I'm sorry, but I think that we will never find a solution to that, and that's the real wickedness that's going on.
I read a scenario, in fact, a guest we had on the program some time ago talked about U.S. nuclear plants, a scenario with some sort of an EMP situation or a solar flare that knocks out the grid in this country. If you knock out the grid, you have transportation problems. You wouldn't have trucks being able to get to nuclear plants to deliver fuel, to keep the pumps going, and you could have a whole bunch of meltdowns. I mean, is that a realistic scenario?
Yeah, if a hydrogen bomb is exploded in space, the EMP or electromagnetic pulse is so profound it would knock out the electricity of 6 western states of the US. That's a big area, and therefore no electricity to power the pumps, just like Fukushima, and then you get meltdowns all over the place. That's absolutely true. Or a cascading effect like happened a few years ago. Some tree fell on a power line in the Midwest, and the cascading effect affected power supply to the eastern states and New York and the like. And they took ages to work out what happened there. We're at the mercy of all sorts of natural occurrences or human-induced scenarios. I mean, let's face it, if the Second World War was fought today in Europe, Europe would be uninhabitable for the rest of the time because it's covered with nuclear reactors. It would be so radioactive no one could ever live there again. Therefore, wars can only be fought in developing countries with no nuclear power plants. That's the first thing. The second thing, a nuclear power plant is a bomb factory. It manufactures 500 pounds of plutonium a year. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,400 years. It lasts for 500,000 years. You only need 5 pounds to make yourself a nuclear weapon. So any country with a nuclear power plant can make, 500 bombs a year if it wants, and that's for the rest of time. So America's selling them to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and, to tyrant countries. Not that America isn't a tyrant country itself, along with Russia, holding the world at nuclear ransom every second of every day. It's amazing to me how hypocritical countries can be and how they project their dark side out onto other countries rather than, as Jesus said, see not the mote in the other person's eye, look instead for the mote in your own eye, and develop humility and wisdom and sagaciousness.
Well, I think you'd have an easier time fixing the situation at Fukushima than waiting for that. Have there been any...
Oh, I don't agree with that. I helped to lead a revolution in America called the Nuclear Weapons Freeze in the 80s, where I was an alien, a woman. I recruited 23,000 physicians to an organisation called Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we started to educate people about the medical effects of nuclear war. And when I first went to America in 1978, almost every person I spoke to said, well, it's better to be dead than red. And I thought, this is psychotic. They'd rather be killed in a nuclear war than be a communist. So we started having symposia all around the country about the medical effects of nuclear war. And journalists would say, what are doctors talking about this for? This is a political issue. We said, no. Nuclear war will create the final epidemic of the human race. And in 5 years, and I had a lot of exposure on television because I had a Hollywood agent who put me on 60 Minutes and all sorts of programs. And in 5 years, 80% of people were opposed to nuclear war. And the concept of nuclear war, the film The Day After, was made because of our activities. And I met with Reagan in the White House, and we met with Gorbachev, and the Cold War came to an end in 1989. That was the Second American Revolution, and it certainly can happen. We can eliminate nuclear weapons. We can, if we want our grandchildren to have a future.
Let's talk about nuclear power plants again.
And we make sure they clean their teeth and have their immunizations, but don't care if they don't have a future, then they're doomed.
Well, I agree with you. And let's talk about the situation in Japan. Are there any engineering solutions that might work? Could you cover the thing with concrete? Put a dome over it? I mean, I'm sort of being facetious, but I would think that the folks at Bechtel must have some idea in mind, and even though they haven't been invited in, that they would want to drop a dime and call somebody in Japan and say, hey, we've got an idea that might work. Is there anything that might work?
Yes, it's a very good question. TEPCO, in its ignorance, and I may say stupidity, put a wall, a concrete wall, between the reactors and the ocean to prevent the water coming down from the mountain, draining into the ocean. But guess what? It acted as a dam, and the water quickly superseded and flowed over the top of the dam. So that made the situation worse. What Arnie Gunderson suggests is that you build a 2-metre-long wall of zeolite which absorbs cesium some distance from the reactors towards the mountain. And so that stops the radioactive water under the reactors mixing with the mountain water, and then you put a whole engineering situation of pipes and tunnels to divert the water coming from the mountain around the wall and into the ocean so it's clean water. He said that could be done, and he suggested that. Meanwhile, TEPCO, in a crazy notion, wants to build an ice wall around the reactor, but it would have to operate for 50 years if the electricity, like refrigeration tubes going into the ground like 100 feet and forming ice in the earth that prevents the water from getting to the other side. But, if there's a power failure, the ice will melt. It would require a hell of a lot of electricity, huge amounts of global warming gas generated. And the solution you just came up with was they could, in fact, remove a lot of the buildings, the height of the buildings where the damage cores are, and, fill it all up with concrete. 3 of them, Unit 1, 2, and 3. Unit 4 is a much more problematic situation, as I previously described. So that's a possibility. It will not fix the situation, and in 100 years, those cores will be intensely radioactive still, and the water will still be flowing through them. So I don't know. I mean, they're the only solutions I've read about or heard about.
I want to ask you another question about the scenario you raised about if it hits the fan and something happens, you would call your family in Boston and tell them to get to the Southern Hemisphere. I'm having that in my head, and I'm thinking, I would do the same thing. But the reality of so many people fleeing the north for the south it'd be a nightmare.
Billions of people, absolutely.
And I'm not sure that the host countries would be all that cooperative.
Well, Australia's not even letting refugees come from Iraq and Afghanistan, and where we've been bombing the hell out of them, to come here. We're a very racist country. So, I think that would be, it's a physical impossibility. What really staggers me is that, we've come to rely on modern medicine, and we've done wonderful things. We cure things that, when I was a medical student, patients just died. And, you had a headache, you take a Tylenol, you have this, you do this, and there's usually a pill for what you need. And what people don't understand is that if you are eating radioactive food, there's nothing to take to get the radiation out of your body, that there is no cure for this. And I understand the difficulty people have in accepting that fact, but it's the truth. There is nothing we can do.
So if somebody tells you to take iodine or something, it's not going to make...
That is the one thing we can do. If there is a meltdown and it's near you and you know it's occurring, because you won't know because they don't usually tell you for days, by which time you've breathed in the radiation cloud as it's flown over you. But if you know it's happening, before the radiation gets to you, you take a potassium iodide tablet, inert iodine, and you only take one. It supersaturates the thyroid, so the thyroid will not take up the radioactive iodine. Well, it protects it to 70%, so it does take some up. Also, cesium concentrates in thyroid as well, and you can't block cesium uptake, but it doesn't stop the radiation going to all the other organs of the body: brain, spleen, liver, bone marrow, testicles, ovaries, you name it.
Helen, we're going to go to a break here in about 2 minutes. Have you? I know you've written papers about Fukushima. Have you written a book?
No, but I held a conference in New York at the New York Academy of Medicine in March, the second anniversary, for 2 days, called The Medical and Ecological Consequences of Fukushima, with the leading scientists in the world presenting the very latest data on humans and disease and ecology and stuff. That now has been converted into a book by the New Press called Crisis Without End. Crisis Without End, which will be published, I hope, fairly early next year. And it is a sort of the Bible, an encyclopedia, if you will, of the very latest scientific data that is now available about Fukushima.
Is there some place that people could read your papers on this?
You go to my website, HelenCaldicottFoundation.org. You can download that whole symposium and listen to it, and soon the whole transcript will be on that webpage, so you can read the transcript of the original presentation.
Well, good. We're going to have links on our website to your website. I know you've written previous books, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, and another book called Loving This Planet that I would assume explore some of these same themes, even if they were written before the Japanese disaster happened. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a series of interviews I did on my radio program with all sorts of fascinating people all around the world, like do cell phones cause brain cancer and all sorts of fascinating stuff. There's another book called If You Love This Planet that deals with global warming and nuclear power and toxic pollution and plastics and the whole thing, yeah. If you go to my webpage, HelenCaldicott.com, all my books are listed on that webpage.
Of course, global warming, climate change, that presses a whole bunch of different buttons, and it automatically makes people defensive because I'm sure in your country as well as here, it's a hot button issue, and some people don't want to hear it. And especially because people like President Obama, they say nuclear energy is an answer to global warming.
Well,
It's
he's a puppet of the nuclear industry. He took $250,000 from Exelon to be elected. And I just need half an hour with Obama. He's a good man. He's highly intelligent. He loves those two daughters. I need to sit down with him as a pediatrician and say, look, Barack, this is what radiation does to children, and talk him through and educate him. I only need half an hour if I could get to him.
Well, let me see if I can help you arrange that. Dr. Helen Caldicott is our guest. We're going to open up the phone lines, I promise, when we get back, and answer as many of your questions as we can. Much more to come. Stay with us. We're talking with Dr. Helen Caldicott about the dangers of nuclear power, in particular the threat posed by the Japanese nuclear incident, disaster, debacle, call it what you will, and the threat that continues for all of us. We all have a stake in it, she says. When we come back, the phone lines are full. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can on Coast to Coast AM. We're going to the phones with questions for my guest, Dr. Helen Caldicott. I should mention that listeners have alerted me that, Helen, the bandwidth on your website has been exceeded. I think you probably got a whole bunch of hits all of a sudden, so I hope people will be patient and try back over the next couple hours and next couple of days, because you're not going anywhere, so people will still be able to access the information in the days to come. International line, Al in Vancouver. Good morning, Al.
Yeah, hello. Outstanding show. Disturbing, but outstanding. I have a question. Now, if I understand correctly, during some parts of sleep and during some meditations, the immune system gets into a state of heightened DNA repair. So my question is, can the natural DNA repair capabilities of the immune system be strengthened enough by meditation or perhaps some kind of technology that induces a field in people's bodies? Could it be strengthened enough to counteract radiation to any degree?
No.
To counteract radiation mutation to any degree?
No. The DNA can repair itself, and often does, but when it's been damaged by radiation, often the repair is faulty. And it's only the regulatory genes, they're quite complex. If they're damaged, that regulate the rate of cell division and mitosis, if they're damaged, the cell sits latently and quietly for a long time, 2 to 8 years, and then one day it starts dividing. And no, I would say as a physician, it sounds good, but unfortunately it might give you false hope. Not everyone's going to get cancer, let's be frank, and cancer is very common. 30% of people or so get cancer. We can cure some cancers now, particularly with chemotherapy and the like, although that's very traumatic. But we are going to see a huge increase in cancer because of this accident. We're seeing it already in Chernobyl, and it's only 28 years since that accident. And the ground in 40% of Europe is contaminated with radioactive elements and will be so for the next 300 to 1,000 years. I mean, there's plutonium all over the place that lasts for 500,000 years. So things are grim. And as I said previously, people expect that there's something they can do to fix it. The only way you can fix it is to get off your chairs and your couches, take over the Congress, take over your parliament, stop Canada exporting uranium, stop Australia exporting uranium, stop America building reactors and selling them all over the place to the third world. That's what we've got to do. Use our democracies, and it doesn't work by Twitter or Facebook or computers. It works by putting your body on the line and organizing like we always used to do.
Al, thank you for the call. East of the Rockies, George in Jacksonville, Florida. Good morning, George.
Yes, good morning. Helen, I'm a chemical engineer with a minor in pharmacy, and I've worked in 13 countries in various industries. My process control experience cuts across industries. And I had problems. Well, my father worked for the Atomic Energy Commission. I had problems with the Japanese in Korea, loss of faith. They made a real mess of a project there. I know the mentality, and I want to suggest 5 things which will help clean this mess up. It's a long-term problem, but we can mitigate it to some degree. You've covered the first, which is bypass the water. The second is the most effective way of taking radiation out of water, concentrating it, is chromatography. And I work for a company that produced very large chromatography columns. Normally they're found in laboratories, tiny things, but these
Well, is that what the Japanese are using at Fukushima? It's a French mechanism. I can't remember the exact name of it, but those machines keep breaking down all the time. But how does chromatography work, and can it remove over 100 isotopes from the water?
Yes, it does. In a laboratory, it's used to detect the individual items, and it does it by absorption of those items within a ceramic structure. You can also just use sand on very large molecules.
And what do you do with then when you've got it adsorbed?
First it goes in, and then they come out of that porous structure at different rates. So at the end of the pipe, you can separate it out, and once you separate it out, you really, frankly, have to put it in a desert area or the Marianas
radioactive waste dump. So, how can you handle, hundreds of millions of gallons of water?
The chromatography units can be built in any size.
To handle the ocean, George? To handle the ocean?
No, that is a big problem, a severe problem. And on the other end, and you're a doctor, if I have an EPFX unit, which is a quantum mechanics unit, which I've been using because we have radiation coming out of the Florida aquifer, and I'm seeing much more radiation from the Fukuoka thing here in Florida. And so we started a program 6 years ago when we got this unit to take minerals which displace radiation and using chelating agents. And you have hydrangea, algae, and you have to be careful of the source because it can be sourced out of the ocean. And then charcoal, but you have to take the minerals first, or body functions will go down. You can have heart attacks and things of that nature. It should be done under the care of a doctor. And of course, the last thing is detection and cleaning things up. And we have been able to reduce our radiation levels, and we saw the beginnings of leukemia in my family, and we've been able to kind of reduce that. But it takes some severe effort, and this is a disaster on a massive scale. We need to, as you said, get control of Congress and the legislatures around the world and actually deal with this problem and not stick our head in the sand.
Well, also they need education. Let's be frank. Most politicians are scientifically and medically illiterate. They're lawyers and businessmen or whatever. And they need to be educated, and how the hell you educate them is difficult. The only way really to educate people is through the media. The media is determining the fate of the earth, and when people like Murdoch have such control of the media, and Fox, and the like, it's difficult. But
frankly, it's on both sides, and I've been a Democrat, I've been a Republican, I have 4 elected officials in my immediate ancestry. I started political campaigns at age 5, waving from an open car, and there are ways to get through to people. And I'm working with members of Congress right now to show them.
Well, and also every person has in their state. They've got 2 senators and they've got their Congress people. And to use a democracy doesn't mean voting, although in Australia voting is compulsory, and everyone should vote or not live in a democracy. Number one, and number two. Every time the congressperson or senator comes back to the district, you make an appointment and you take doctors in white coats and you take people like yourself and educate them.
Right. Well, you do that, but you also get involved in the organizations, both on the left and right, who will replace people in Congress. They really understand when you work to replace them.
Hey, George, thank you for the call. Yeah, you should run. Thank you, George. Appreciate the call. Best of luck to you. West of the Rockies, Randy in Phoenix. Hi, Randy.
Hello, this is Randy. Thank you for listening to me and being on the show. I was to speak at the IAE conference in Vienna, July 2nd at 1400 hours. So I do know a little bit what I'm saying. I'm going to talk very fast and download a lot of information. First of all, the Japanese are monitoring 1.5 million children for thyroid problems that were in the contaminated area around Fukushima. Everyone.
Can I answer that?
Huh?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Everyone has.
They're monitoring up to nearly 1 million children. they have
million.
only got halfway through it, and they're finding thyroid lesions in about 40%, and only a few of them are getting biopsies to find out if these lesions are malignant. So,
and actually, I was told that it's all of them. They're eventually all just coming up to the peg of getting anomalies. The one reason why it's so contaminated is because in the beginning they only had readers, or the Geiger counters, to sit there and go up to 100 millisieverts when they were pegging. To show you how bad it is, 4 weeks ago, 11 workers were working around the tanks, and they got splashed with water from the dams that they built around the tanks because the tanks are leaking. Yep. 6 of them got splashed with 18,000 millisieverts of water.
Well, what is that in REMS?
3 to 4 days.
What's 18,000 millisieverts in REMS? That's 180 REMS?
Yes, and the tanks are already
really
up to 36 million millisieverts.
Wow.
Well, that's a lethal dose.
Yeah, well,
the
yeah.
Dose,
and part of the problem with the dam, of building the ice dam, is that creates a negative void, and because you have seawater coming in twice with tides a day, that seawater goes in underneath to the cavity of where the, shall we say, the China syndrome is, and then that washes back out to sea.
Yeah.
What's also being dumped out in the ocean, even from the beginning, was not just cesium, but strontium.
Yep, and lots of others.
And then the other thing is that the head engineer of Fukushima just died 3 weeks ago.
Esophageal cancer, yes.
Yeah. And what they don't tell you about is the 300 workers that they kept in prison when the accident happened, and they sent in troops. The reason why they sent in troops is because some of the workers decided to go home and die, and they couldn't have that. So they sent in troops to keep the people in there, and they were in horrible conditions, eating 1 bowl of rice a day and getting just 2 units of bottled water.
Yeah.
And basically they're gone. The other problem is that the Fukushima, or I should say TEPCO, has just received $1.5 billion in Japanese bonds to start the cleanup, which is not going to be enough.
No, you need 500 billion.
The other problem is now that where they're going to start building a lot of the facilities there for the Tokyo Olympics on the ground.
Yeah. Oh, that's crazy.
My gosh. Oh.
They're dumping incinerated radioactive
waste. They are having a problem and have already postponed the development because they're trying to find out because the ground became contaminated. A lot of people don't know. Tokyo got radiated 4 times.
Correct.
Yes.
Areas of Tokyo are highly radioactive.
Yes.
But tell me, what is the IAEA going to do about this?
Stick their head in the sand.
Why?
Well, actually, the IAEA and the Americans did go over last 2 weeks ago because the Japanese government invited them over to look at the problem. And basically, there's really not much you can do. It's so big, it's so disastrous.
Yeah.
Wow.
And encasing it in concrete would be a good idea, but you got to remove all the debris, and that's highly radioactive. That will take a long time to do. And then where you're going to put it, and then the concrete will only last 100 years because of the radiation, and it will just start disintegrating.
Hey, Randy, I appreciate all the info. Seems like you have your finger on the pulse. I would appreciate it if you'd send me an email. Just send me an email or contact me, and I'd like to be in touch with you and also put you into contact with Helen so you guys can continue the conversation.
Yes, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for the call, man. That was some good information. Wildcard line, Jocelyn in Wisconsin. Hi, Jocelyn. Good morning.
Hi, good evening, George. Thank you very much for putting up this program, and thank you very much, Dr. Caldicott, because I'm 68 years old, and I just don't see us solving any of our huge problems on this planet that we create ourselves. And how can people that are supposedly so intelligent build reactors on an island that is prone for earthquakes and tsunamis? There's something that is so insane to me. I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but I mean, I heard a long time ago or read that this was a lot worse than Chernobyl, and it's the detail that you have explained tonight, Doctor, is so excruciatingly
depressing,
unbelievable, and I'm so disgusted with humanity. I really think that we're headed for, I hate to say this, I just don't see us doing any better. We just don't learn.
Jocelyn, it sounds like Helen, though, isn't ready to give up, though. Helen, you think we can get through this?
Oh, well, look, I'm 75. I've been doing this work for 43 years, and no one's going to stop me. And I still am optimistic because, you know, I believe in the goodness of people, and I know when I give a good lecture to 1,000 people or 5,000 people, I change their lives that night, and off they go and become really active. Often, many of them are women, let me say. And it depends upon the drive you have and how much you love your own life and love your children. And, you know, I'm sitting here and I can watch kangaroos out my back door and the most beautiful parrots and seagulls just right here where I am. This, for me, I'm a pantheist. This, for me, is my God. And I'm damned if we're going to destroy life in the universe. So I once asked Carl Sagan, the great astronomer, did he think there was any other life in the universe? And he paused for a long time and he said no. And I said, why, Carl? And he said, because if other species had reached our stage of development, they would have destroyed themselves. But I know as a doctor that even people who've lived wicked lives on their deathbed or when their children are dying, they'll fall into my arms and weep and recant and tell me all the wicked things they've done. In other words, that purity and conscience with which they were born is with them till the day they die. People know when they're doing bad things, and they must be called to order on it. And that's what a democracy is about. And we've got to wake that democracy in America up.
Jocelyn, thanks for the call. Anita in New York City, try to get one more call in. Better make it a quick one. Anita, good morning.
Yes. Thank you, George, for this program. And I'm looking for Helen to be a regular part of the Coast family. Also, Helen, thanks for the TSA warning. A friend got cancer stepping into those machines a year later. Briefly, I'm a great lover of salmon. It has excellent health benefits, including mood boosting and sometimes snapper and kingfish. So my question is, can I test the fish? Is the government testing the fish? What are your thoughts in terms of...
It's a very good question, Anita.
Thank you, Anita.
And I'll over the air.
Thanks.
Yeah, the EPA is not testing the fish on the West Coast. It's not testing the ambient air flowing from Fukushima over the North America, nor is it testing the water or the food adequately. So you must demand, and people in New York, you can be very demanding, that the EPA get on and routinely test those fish that are being caught every week, all the time, and the food and the water and the air. Because if there is another major release of radiation, if Building 4 collapses or, God help, if something else happens, they have to know what's going on. And therefore, you must demand that your government become responsible. In hours, the heat was so profound that this radioactive material, 100 tons, started to melt. And it melted its way in 3 reactors through a 6 inches of steel in the containment vessel and onto the reactor floor. And indeed, we think that they have maybe melted their way into the Earth, which is called the melt through to China syndrome by the nuclear industry. At the same time, huge amounts of radiation were released, and at the same time, because of certain dynamics, there were 4 hydrogen explosions, which totally blew the roof off 4 of the reactors. And so massive amounts of radiation were released. The government of Japan knew where the radiation was going, as did the American government that was flying planes overhead to find out where the radiation went. But the government of Japan failed to tell the Japanese people where the radiation was going because they didn't want to create, quote, panic, end quote. So hundreds of thousands of people fled in the direction of the highest radiation doses. At the same time, huge amounts of radioactive water were emitted into the Pacific Ocean, higher than any other event in history. This is the worst industrial accident ever to have occurred, but it's not over, because what's happened is that the Fukushima reactors were built on an ancient riverbed, and there are mountains behind the reactors, and water keeps pouring down from the mountains underneath the reactors. Now, when they were operating, they could pump that water out, but now they can't. And what has happened in the ground beneath the reactors has become sodden, sort of liquefied mud. Two of the buildings, Unit 3, which had a meltdown, and Unit 4, are very perilously damaged. And if there's another earthquake greater than 7 at the site, it is thought that Unit 3 could collapse on top of its molten core, producing maybe a huge fire. We don't know, but releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. And Unit 4 was emptied of its radioactive fuel just before the accident, just serendipitously. And over 100 tons, about 250 tons actually, of highly radioactive, very hot uranium is in a cooling pool 100 feet above the ground, resting perilously on this damaged building, which is buckled. Now, if there's an earthquake, that building could collapse. Down would come the cooling pool. The water would drain out of it. The fuel rods would catch fire, and 10 times more cesium than was released at Chernobyl would be released into the atmosphere, and you would have to be very worried in the Northern Hemisphere. Also, TEPCO now, Tokyo Electric Power Company, has decided to try and remove those rods from that cooling pool. But because the building was so damaged and the crane they used previously fell down, they've erected a new steel structure around Building 4 so they can put a huge crane on top. Now, when you remove radioactive rods...
Switching gears now to Fukushima, the disaster, the debacle that is still pumping thousands of tons of radioactive waste into the oceans. Dr. Helen Caldicott is going to talk about that right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Helen Caldicott has spent more than 40 years as part of an international campaign to educate the public about the hazards of the nuclear age and changes in human behavior that protect the environment. In particular, she's written extensively about Fukushima and the disaster that seemingly dropped off the radar screen for most of us Americans, at least, if we get our news from the mainstream media. Dr. Caldicott making her first appearance on Coast to Coast. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
You're in Australia.
I am.
What time of day is it there?
It is 6:15 approximately at night.
Okay, well, I'm glad I didn't get you up too early. Dr. Helen, what is your doctorate in?
I'm a physician and I'm a pediatrician. My specialty is cystic fibrosis, the most common fatal genetic disease of childhood. I trained at Harvard, and I'm a pediatrician.
How did you get involved in nuclear issues?
Yeah. Well, when I was about 18 or a bit younger, I read a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute.
Oh, yeah.
And it was set in Melbourne, where I grew up in Australia. It was about a nuclear war that occurred by accident, and everyone in the world was killed except people in Melbourne because we were so far south. And gradually the radioactive cloud came down to Melbourne, and people had their last gin and tonic at the Melbourne Club. And then the government dispensed cyanide capsules so people could kill their babies immediately rather than dying of the terrible effects of acute radiation illness, vomiting and bleeding to death. And at the end of the book, the beautiful, elegant streets of Melbourne still stood with trams and bits of paper blowing down in the breeze and a blind gently flapping. And that was the end of life on Earth. And that image marred my soul, and I was never the same again.
Let's talk about...
Then I entered first-year medical school at 17, and I learned how radiation causes genetic abnormalities and cancer. And at that time, 1956, Russia and America were going hell for leather, blowing up bombs in the atmosphere, heavily irradiating the Northern Hemisphere. And as a young, innocent medical student, the age of 17, I couldn't understand what these men thought they were doing. And so that's always been part of my psyche.
I don't know what it's like in Australia, but here it seems like we hear very little about Fukushima in mainstream media. It's as if the problem went away. Is it the same there?
Yes, it is actually. And the uranium in the Fukushima reactors was Australian uranium. So we're in the process of killing a lot of people, hundreds of thousands, I would think, over time, because it takes a long time for cancer to incubate. We don't get much news here either, unless there's another major accident at Fukushima, which is absolutely on the cards. There could be another explosion, huge release of radiation, all sorts of things, or another earthquake which could collapse some of the buildings. So we're on the tip of an iceberg, tip of the sort of cliff of real nuclear catastrophe. But because Obama's pro-nuclear, because of the very great power of the nuclear industry in America, which is allied to the nuclear weapons industry, and because of the abysmal ignorance of journalists at this time about the medical effects of radiation and nuclear power, this issue is not being attended to. It will be in time, but at the moment it's being ignored, which is extraordinary.
Paint a picture for us what the situation on the ground is at Fukushima now.
Okay, so within hours and days, 3 huge nuclear power plants melted down. These power plants were designed by General Electric, built in the 70s, and I knew the 3 GE engineers who designed them, and they resigned because they knew that these reactors were fallible and not safe. They testified before the U.S. Congress, but it made no difference. So they built 6 nuclear power plants, 6, on an earthquake fault. Japan, of course, is intersected by lots and lots of earthquake faults. And the risk of having an earthquake, they predicted, was 1 in a million or whatever. So there was an earthquake, a huge one, 9 on the Richter scale, and then a massive tsunami resulted and came in and absolutely drowned the reactors, the external electricity supply that supplies the power to the water pumps that have to pump 1 million gallons of water each minute to each reactor. That's 6 reactors, 6 million gallons a minute failed because there was no electricity. There were diesel pumps beneath the reactors in the basement, but they got flooded. Therefore, there was no power to cool these intensely hot 100 tons mass of seething radioactivity in the reactors. And within